Tonight's featured speaker is Chuck Marohn. He is the founder and president of Strong Towns. He's a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota. And he has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's in urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. This past year, Chuck was recognized by Planetian as one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. This puts him in company with Frederick Law Olmsted and Frank Lloyd Wright.
There might be a little recency bias in some of that.
So we are very excited to have Chuck with us this evening. He has presented his Strong Town concepts to hundreds of communities across North America. And we're delighted to have him here with us. And with that, I would ask you to join me in welcoming Chuck.
Thank you. Thank you. I went to the University of Minnesota. This sweet woman back here brought a book for me tonight to show some of the architecture that her husband's great-great-grandfather did in the state of Minnesota, including some of the buildings I went to at the University of Minnesota. So that was incredibly kind of you. Thank you so much. I grew up on a farm in central Minnesota that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents, and grew up in this small town. And when I turned 17, joined the Minnesota National Guard, and then graduated from high school, went away to college, and returned as a civil engineer to work in this place that I really love, this small town, this rural area that I cared deeply about. And I did engineering projects for the cities that I had grown up in and been in for my entire life. And after a number of years of working really hard and doing things that I thought was making my place stronger and better off and healthier, I started to have this sinking feeling that I wasn't doing very good work. And it's not that I wasn't doing good work, it's that the work we were doing as a firm, as a profession, was maybe lacking something. And I decided at the time that what I thought it was lacking was a real knowledge and understanding of what it takes to build a city, to build a place, to do planning. As an engineer in a small town, I was doing a lot of planning, and I wasn't a good planner. I knew that, I understood that. I understood how to design a pipe, I understood how to build a road. I did not really understand the nuances of building a great city. So I had an opportunity to go back to the University of Minnesota for graduate school and get a degree in planning. When I did that, some cities that I had done engineering work for called and asked me if I would help out with this planning job and this planning job. By the time I was done with school, I actually had my own planning firm. I'd hired a couple of my classmates and was doing planning work for cities all over the state. At one point, we had 5 offices and 13 staff, and we were doing planning work in small towns and rural areas all over the state of Minnesota. Again, I kind of had this sinking feeling that the work we were doing was not actually the best work that needed to be done. In fact, a lot of the problems that I thought I could solve, that engineers were struggling with, that I could solve as a planner, I found I was kind of impotent to solve them as a planner as well. And by the time we got to 2008, and everything started to kind of unravel and go bad, I'm not going to pretend that I had called the housing crisis. I certainly did not see that or understand, that was coming. But I was looking at a lot of the stuff that I had been working on and warning the communities that we were working with, this does not work. This stuff does not work. And by the time we got to 2008, and we were bailing out banks and having trillion-dollar rescue packages from Congress and having, what at the time felt like one of the craziest election cycles I had ever been through. It looks kind of quaint now that we look back at it, but at the time it felt really insane. I remember just not knowing what to do and feeling very frustrated. And I sat down and I said, I'm going to try to develop these thoughts that are in my brain in the only way that I really know how, and that is to write. I'm someone who likes to write, and if you're a writer, you understand that actually forcing yourself to put your thoughts down on paper is a very productive exercise. It forces you to think through things in a way that just passive conversation or passively thinking about them doesn't. And so I started to struggle with this one kind of central question: why are our cities going broke? Why, despite all the job programs, all the infrastructure programs, all the investments, all the growth, all the things we've done to create success and prosperity in all of these communities that I work with, why do they all struggle to do basic things? Why can't we keep our police and firefighters employed? Why can't we keep our library open past 4:30? Why do we have to shut the street lights off overnight because, we can't afford to keep them on? Why can't we fix the sidewalk? Why can't we put in a crosswalk? Why can't we do these basic things? Why can't we maintain the park so it's not overgrown with weeds? Why? Why can we find millions of dollars to put into a shortcut around the south side of town, but we can't find, $50 a year to keep the street light on overnight? Why? Why is this? And so I didn't really have the answers, but I thought I knew the direction the conversation was going. So I started to write. And after a year of writing 3 times a week, some friends and colleagues of mine encouraged me to start a nonprofit. They said, "Chuck, there's a lot of really good stuff here. You should do something with this. You should start a nonprofit." And I said, "No, I hate nonprofits. I don't want anything to do with one. I'm trying to run a business. Leave me alone." And they said, "Well, I tell you what, you just keep writing, we'll fill out the paperwork." And so they did. They filled out the paperwork, they paid the fee, they submitted it to the IRS. A year later, we had a 501c3. And a few months after that, a foundation in central Minnesota contacted me and said, "Hey, we've been reading your stuff. We're very interested in what you're doing. We see you're a 501c3 nonprofit. Why don't you come and tell us what your programs are? We're interested in knowing about you." And I said, "Well, we don't have any programs. It's just me." And he said, "Well, come up here and talk to us." So I did. I went up and I actually gave them one of the very first versions of this presentation we're going to go through tonight. And they said, "Chuck, this is really important stuff. We're going to give you 3 years of startup money to leave your planning firm and go out and share this with as many places as you can." So since 2011, I have been first in central Minnesota, and then all over Minnesota, and then in the Midwest, and then went out to California, and in 2013 I came here to Pennsylvania and did a week-long tour around the state where I spoke in a dozen different places: Hershey, Lancaster, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Media, York. Trying to think of some of the other ones we were in over the course of a week. Saw a lot of your state. I've been doing this for years and years and years, trying to answer this question: why are cities struggling financially? And what can we do differently so that we can experience stability and prosperity? So let's answer that question and then have a deeper conversation about what comes next. Our organization, our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I always get in trouble from my staff because I'm supposed to say at the beginning, we're a member-supported organization, so if you like our message, we ask you to share it with somebody else. If you really like our message, you can sign up and become a member and help us spread it to other places. I'll give you our address at the end. But let me start out with this. I want you to think about the way we built cities thousands and thousands of years ago. These are 2 artist renderings. The one on the left is an ancient city called Ur, 4000 BC in the Fertile Crescent. The one on the right, of course, is ancient Rome. When we think about these cities, we understand that they were built around the dominant transportation technology of the day, that, of course, being your 2 feet. People would walk everywhere they went in cities like this, and so the spacing, the scale, the distances between things you would do on a normal day, all this was based around a society of people who walked. Fast forward thousands of years, this is my hometown. Back in the early 1900s. I live in Brainerd, Minnesota. For those of you that don't know where this is, it's a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's in kind of the middle of the state, the lake country. The Canadian forest comes down, and on the edge of that is my little hometown. This is what it looked like in the early 1900s. People would arrive by train, they would arrive by stagecoach, but once they got here, they would walk everywhere they went. And so what you would see is that the spacing, the scale, the distances between different things you would do on a normal day, all this was very similar to what we had seen in societies for thousands and thousands of years. Beginning in the early 1900s and then accelerating after World War II, we of course began to build our cities around a different transportation technology, right? We began to build them around the automobile. We came up with different building types, different building styles, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. If we were to go outside tonight and pick a dozen people at random and ask them to explain this transition, they would more than likely talk about it in terms of progress. We used to be a society of people who walk, so we build cities around people who walk. Now we are a society of people who drive, so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people in jet cars. And someday we will teleport, and we'll build cities completely different than we do today. This is a narrative of progress. And it's very comforting for us to think of things in this way, because it puts us on this continuum of things always getting better. I want you to think of this in a slightly different way. I'm going to put an idea, plant a little seed in the back of your head as a different way to look at this, a different way that is not so affirming, not so comforting. When we look at these ancient cities, what we have to understand is that by the time you get to even ancient Ur, humans had been experimenting with how to build places for thousands and thousands of years. The knowledge for how to do this came about through trial and error experimentation. People tried things. What worked, they would keep and expand upon. What didn't work, those societies failed. Those people sometimes died. Those places went away. Those ideas weren't transmitted to the next generation. By the time you get to ancient Rome, you have an approach to building places honed and refined over thousands and thousands of years through trial and error experimentation. By the time you get to my hometown, oops, wrong way, in the early 1900s, you have an approach to building that is essentially universal. We can go to different cultures, different continents, different latitudes, and while we see different architectural styles and different building materials, the essential layout and design of our places is essentially universal. We see the same thing everywhere we go. When we look at this style of development, we understand that this wasn't developed through trial and error experimentation, right? As a young engineer, when I would ask questions, and the engineers that have been around a while will say, well, Chuck, come on, this is the way things have always been done. Of course, this isn't the way things have always been done, right? We've only been doing this a very, very short period of time. The ideas for this didn't come from trial and error. We didn't try this out in, say, Ohio for a couple hundred years, see how it worked there, and then import those ideas here, right? What did we do? We just took this set of ideas and applied them across an entire continent within a generation. Where do these ideas come from? They largely came from, European intellectuals, think tanks, universities. These were theories of how we could use this new technology to transform a continent and make things better for everybody. It's important for us to grasp how big of an experiment this is. No society has ever taken, on a continental scale, and reworked everything about how they live within such a short period of time. Not only how we get around, how we interact with each other, how we finance our places, our politics, our conversations, our families, our social lives. We have transformed everything about what it means to have human habitat in an incredibly short period of time. What I want to talk about tonight are some of the financial ramifications of this shift. Ramifications that I think some people at the time saw, but wasn't really a broad part of our cultural conversation. One of the things that we did early on at Strong Towns was to look at our development pattern and say, what parts of it can we actually measure and understand, and what can that tell us about the rest of the system? Cities are complicated places. We widen roads, we bury pipe extra deep. We do all kinds of things from an engineering standpoint in anticipation of other things happening. But there are parts of our system where there's not a lot of background noise, there's not a lot of weird things happening. We can actually take those and look at them and try to understand what's going on, such as this. This is a dead-end cul-de-sac. Let me see, I do have a pointer here. These are just residential homes along a dead-end street. There's no through traffic, there's no commercial traffic. The only reason this street exists is to provide access to the homes that are here. When this was built, the city decided they wanted the road paved. The city agreed to pay half the cost if the property owners paid the other half. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city is collecting from the people who live in this development, the only people who use the road in any meaningful way, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the money they spent to build the road? Well, the answer is 37 years. Now understand, the road's not going to last 37 years, but it's going to take the city that long just to break even. When the city has to go out and fix it, where's that money going to come from? Not from these property owners here. Here's another development. This one is a closed loop system with a dead-end cul-de-sac. Again, no through traffic, no commercial traffic. This road just exists to serve these homes here. If the homes didn't exist, there'd be no need for this road. This was built in the early 1980s. A developer came in, paid all the costs of building the homes, putting in all the infrastructure. Of course, the cost for the infrastructure was rolled into the sale price of the homes. The people who purchased them have counted that as part of their property value. They've been paying that on their mortgage. At the same time, they've been paying taxes to the city to go out and fix and maintain it. When the road fell apart, the city went out and fixed it. The cost was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city is collecting from the people who live in this development, how long is it going to take them to recoup the amount of money they just spent to fix the road? The answer is 79 years. Now, the road's not going to last anywhere near that long. So we said, all right, let's say the city wanted to, between now and the time the road fell apart, collect enough money from these property owners to actually go out and fix the road. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the water, the storm sewer, those are vastly more expensive undertakings. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, we get it. We know we lose money on residential property. We make it up on commercial. Commercials are our cash cow, right? To which my initial response is like, okay, how's that working out for you? And then I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does and tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would think it's okay to lose money on 90% of what you do as long as you can make it up on the last 10%. This is a business park. This is one of those build it and they will come kind of investments that cities our size like to do, communities and areas our size like to do. This was built in the mid-1990s. It's got the wide industrial streets, the deep pipe. The idea was to attract businesses and growth and jobs into the community. This is completely built out. Every single lot is built upon. The city felt this was so successful, they want to build the same exact thing right next door. So they want to take this and just repeat it right next door. We said, okay, if we could build the same thing for the same amount of money and get the same amount of investment, would that be a good project? In today's dollars, it would be $2.1 million. Today, the tax base out there is $6.6 million. Now, pause for a second. Of that tax base, of that investment that was made in this business park, 4 of the lots are a church. 2 of the lots belong to the school district. It's their bus maintenance building. 1 of the lots is a county maintenance garage. 1 of the lots is a city maintenance garage. All of those are very important, right? We need churches, we need schools, we need maintenance buildings. None of them pay any taxes to the city, 0. Of the remaining properties, the ones that theoretically would pay taxes, every single one was given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move into this park. For the sake of our analysis, we had to assume, and it was the only way we could make the math work, we had to assume that every single lot in the new park would be built on within 12 months of us completing the project. And every single place that opened up would be a full non-subsidized, full tax-paying entity. And every single penny of revenue would go to retiring that bond. If that were the case, it would still take almost 3 decades. It would take 29 years for the city to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would have to go up to plow the snow, mow the ditches, provide police protection, fire protection, and all the services that are needed. And that's in the most wildly optimistic scenario. When I first went and met with that foundation, and I went through about 15, 18 of these case studies, it was pretty quick, obvious that it was overkill, right? I used to do that early in the presentation because I was so proud of these things we had done, and people would just start to cry at a certain point. I found I can make the point in just 3, but I need to kind of walk you through a narrative. So I'm going to do that in the next 3 slides. These are 3 charts of cash flow. And I apologize to people who are not chart people. I'm an engineer, so I think I have a professional obligation to show you some charts. I'll show you 3, and I promise they won't be painful, okay? Let's say that a developer comes to our community. Says, I have a piece of property out here I would like to build upon. I will, at my expense, build all the residential homes. I'll build all the commercial buildings. I'll follow all of your rules and regulations. I'm not asking for any subsidies. I'm not asking for any handouts. I'm not asking for any favors of any type. I will build to your specifications the required roads and streets and curb and sidewalk. I'll put in the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters. I'll pay for all that. The only thing I'm asking for as a developer is that when I finish making this investment in your community, that you, the city, the public, agree that you'll take over the long-term responsibility to service and maintain it indefinitely. What would we say? No? No? You'd be the only city to say no. You mean, as a developer, you're gonna pay for everything? You're going to follow all of our rules to the T. You're not asking for any waivers, any variances. You're going to do everything the way we've asked? Of course we're going to say yes. This is the ideal scenario, right? This is the perfect developer walk in the door. Let's say we're smart. We've heard of this strong town stuff. We're good, prudent people. We're going to take this money when it comes in from this new development. We're going to take the portion that would normally get spent in other parts of the city fixing and maintaining stuff, and we're going to set that aside. And every year when the money comes in, we're going to set that aside and we're going to allow it to accumulate so that when we get out of generation and we have to make good on this promise we're making as we grow, that we will service and take care of this stuff, that we'll have a pot of money there to do it. This is what that looks like. In year 1, everything is brand new, hasn't cost you anything. The developer paid for all those costs. The money comes in from the tax revenue. You take the portion and you set it aside. In year 2, more money comes in. You add to what you had in year 1. In year 3, you add a little bit more. Year 4, 5, and on and on. And you can see a 5-year-old road isn't costing you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything. A 15-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. And so you get out year after year, you just have money coming in, nothing going out. You get out a couple decades, you feel very, very rich. You've got a huge pot of money sitting there. The problem comes in this example in year 25, when you have to make good on that promise you made way back in year 1. And what you find is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far, far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a series of developments, a collection of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes in a couple years after that first project and says, that project worked really well for me, it worked really well for you. I would like to do a similar size project. And every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door with a similar size project. In other words, the scenario we all want, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on all these promises we're making as we grow. Here's what that looks like. Year 1, your first development comes online. It pays in the entire 25 years shown here. Year 3, you've got your second one. It starts to pay in. Year 5, year 7, and on and on. And you can see, not only do you have all this money coming in and nothing going out, but you're having growth upon growth upon growth. Your cash actually starts to accelerate upwards. You're feeling very, very rich. And when you get to year 25, you have to make good on that promise you made way back a generation ago. Yeah, you got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? you've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money over the long term on every project you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is the answer to that question that I struggled with. Why are cities going broke? Why, the more we invest, the more we spend, the more jobs we try to create, the more infrastructure we put in place, why do we have less money? Why is it not making us prosperous? I want to ask you a couple questions about this. Because we live like way, way out here now, right? This is where we all live. Do you recognize yourself in this diagram here? Do you recognize your own behavior? This is why people smoke, right? This is why you'll go home and sit in front of the TV and have a bowl of ice cream instead of going for a walk, right? Oh, this ice cream is good. I love this show. Uh-oh, heart disease, right? These are human failings. We like to talk about the problems that we face in society today, often in political terms. It's a problem of the left. It's the problem of the right. In fact, I'm going to say something right now. If you know in your heart that you are a hyper-partisan person, I want you to take extra care right now to dial your reactionary button dial all the way down to 0, just for 30 seconds. Cut me 30 seconds of slack in the partisan department, okay? If we look back at our last presidential election, we heard a lot of narrative from the right, narrative from the left, blaming the other side. I'll tell you what, to me, I heard in the last presidential election. I heard two 70-year-old candidates looking back at the best time in their life, explaining to us how they could recreate that today. Whether the best time was, make America great, we're going to go back to blue-collar jobs and Ozzie and Harriet families, or whether the best time was a great society where we could expand the reach of government and the things that we could do collectively together, increase Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Whatever the vision was, where was that period of time in American history? It was right here. It was right here. It was 2 decades after the post-war period. It was the peak of the illusion of wealth. It was the peak of this new sugar-high growth pattern before all the bills had come due. We do not live there anymore. We do not live here. We live way, way, way out here with all of these promises come due. That's the answer to that question. Why are our cities struggling? Let me ask you one more question. What happened to this civilization thousands of years ago that built their economy around the exploitation of this human flaw? What happened to them? What happened to the city tens of thousands of years ago with their experimental trial and error? And they said, we can create a whole lot of growth if we just do this. We create a whole lot of prosperity if we just follow. What happened to them? They went away, right? Their ideas were not transmitted on to the next generation. That society failed. We're in strange, uncharted waters. We are in a place that to us, when we sit here today, feels somewhat normal. But when we step back and look at it at a historical lens and grasp the depth and breadth of this experiment, is kind of scary. Nobody has ever been here before. Obviously, there's some huge implications to all this. The more we grow in the pattern that we have chosen, the poorer we become. The more we invest in infrastructure, the more we invest in growth, the more money we spend trying to build our cities in this way, the poorer we get. What we see is that cities local governments are being forced to absorb the costs of their own development pattern. If you want that road fixed, you have to pay for it. If we want to fix that pipe, that money is going to have to come from us. This can't happen in the current pattern of development without some major tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. And by cuts in services, I don't mean, let's trim the park department back or lay off 5% of our firefighters. I mean, this neighborhood is not going to have their road fixed. This pipe just went out. We're not going to replace that. This pump went bad. It serves 200 people, but I'm sorry, we don't have the money to fix it. Now, I didn't come here to tell you what you know, right? We see this in every level of government. Everywhere we're having debates over how big is a tax increase going to be, who's going to pay, how deep is the service cut going to be, and where are we going to make that? I want you to look at the third variable in this sentence, the third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in an approach that is fundamentally insolvent, there's no way that our cities will avoid insolvency. As long as we continue to build in a way that gives us a sugar high illusion of wealth today in exchange for these enormous long-term liabilities, there's no way that our cities will avoid bankruptcy. Whether it's a hard kind of bankruptcy like we see in places like Detroit and Stockton and San Bernardino, or whether it's a soft default like we see in thousands of cities across this country, where they lay off police and firefighters, they don't maintain their parks, they don't maintain their streets and their sidewalks and their public buildings because they just don't have the money to do it. We have to start having a conversation about how we make our cities financially more productive. So what does this look like? How do we do this? And it's really important to pause here because I've come to recognize a truism. And I recognize this first in California because California is kind of the home of American cognitive dissonance. It's like the cultural headquarters of the American cognitive dissonance. I was in California giving this talk from the northern part of the state to the southern part, and I would get to this end of the presentation. For the rest of the time, we're going to talk about how we do things differently. But I would do that, and I would get to the end, and someone would always stand up and say, Chuck, I'm really angry at you. You came here, you scared us, and you didn't tell us the solution. What is the solution to these problems? And it was very frustrating to me because we're going to talk about how we do things differently. But I realized after a while that I was hearing something different than what was actually being asked. What was actually being asked was subtly different. What was actually being asked was this: what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? I think we've come to expect that as a solution. Sometimes we call that kicking the can down the road. We can also call it buying time. I found it most helpful to stop using the word solution. Problems have solutions. Predicaments have outcomes. What we have created for ourselves is a series of predicaments. And we're actually in a phase now where we're going to be managing the outcomes. And so the question that we really have to face is, what do we as people living together in a community that we care deeply and passionately about, what do we, intelligent, thoughtful, caring people working together, looking at this complex set of challenges we face, how do we roll up our sleeves and respond as rational people? And when we start with rational responses, I want to start with this photo here. Again, this is my hometown back in the early 1900s. And I have to tell you, when I first saw this photo, I didn't believe this was my hometown. There's no way. I mean, as a planner, as someone who loves places, and I look at this, the way the buildings line up just perfectly, the way they frame the public realm at just a great ratio. There's great segmentation of the space. The buildings have good symmetry. They front the street in a beautiful way. This is an exquisitely designed street. Let me ask you a few questions about these people here. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees do they have to go to get an approval to build something? How much tax subsidy do they give out? How many shovel-ready sites did they have? How many miles of infrastructure did they put in the ground in order to attract this development? How many engineers and planners and economic developers did they have on staff to make all this happen? These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. Look at what they built. Look at what they built. How did they do this? It's really simple. They just copied what they knew worked. They took the materials they had on hand and they built in a style and an approach that they had seen work for thousands and thousands of years. After 2.5 generations of engineers and planners and economic developers giving advice on how we can create growth and jobs and prosperity, after all the plans and programs and things we've done to kickstart our economy, after all the public investments we've made, here's what this exact same street looks like today. Yeah, that's the proper reaction. It's a wasteland of half-occupied buildings and parking lots. And if you want to grasp in one photo why our cities struggle financially, understand there's $500,000 of public infrastructure in that little stretch of street right there. Where's the wealth that's going to pay to take care of that generation after generation after generation? I was giving a lecture at a university in Boise, Idaho, and I got to this, and a student raised their hand, stood up and said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build the way that you build here in the United States. When we build, we have to build one block at a time. And before we can build the next block, we have to make sure that every gap is filled in on the block we just built. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way. We're a very poor country now, too. We can't afford to build this way either. And for a long period of time, that illusion of wealth made us think that this kind of thing didn't matter. That we could have whole neighborhoods just go bad, and it didn't matter. We could run roads and pipes and stuff all over the place. It didn't matter. We could tear down buildings and create huge parking lots. We could run billion-dollar train investments out to big parking lots in the middle of nowhere. It didn't matter. We were so filthy rich. It didn't matter. The cities that are going to prosper, and this becomes more and more true the smaller you become, the cities that are going to prosper in the next generation are going to be the ones that obsess over this problem. Obsess over return on investment, obsess over financial productivity, obsess over squeezing every last dime out of the investments that we've made. How do we make this shift in thinking? The first thing we have to do is get rid of our worst habits. What's our worst habit? Build it and they will come. Is a fantastic movie plot. It is a horrible economic development strategy. A generation ago, this would have been absurd. But today, we are so desperate for growth. We call this the desperation phase of this suburban experiment. We are so desperate for growth that we will do anything to experience it. We will give away whatever it takes to attract growth. We will have millions of dollars in the ground just in case Amazon or Google comes trolling through town, so we can have a shovel-ready site ready to go. If you want to be considered a serious player in the economic development game today, what do you have to do? You have to have a team of people waiting around to hand out subsidies. You've got to have sites for people all ready to go. This is not how cities build wealth. And this is not how cities have ever built wealth. I'm going to show you right now the very simple way that cities build wealth. Do any of you recognize this city here? Does this look familiar to any of you? It couldn't be Pennsylvania, or I'm sorry, it couldn't be Philadelphia, because there was no camera when Philadelphia was at this stage. But at some point in the past, Philadelphia looked just like that, right? So did Pittsburgh. At some point in the past, Manhattan looked just like that. We could go further west. Chicago had a phase where it looked just like that. Milwaukee, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Seattle, Vancouver. They all started just like that. We can go further south, the trees would be wrong, but Dallas, Houston, they all started just like this, right? Every city that was ever built in all of human history, up until our recent experiment, started like this, right? Some pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams. London started like this. Paris, Rome. This could be Romulus and Remus standing out here. They all started just like this. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does unemployment skyrocket? Does Wall Street crash? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out banks? No. These are little bets. A few people lose a little bit of money, they salvage what they can, they move on to the next place. We built thousands of these across this continent, and for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And so after 30 years of incremental development, this little street here, which is my hometown in 1870, would become this street here. It's the exact same street. And after another 40 years of growing incrementally out, incrementally up, and becoming incrementally more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would become buildings of brick and granite. We don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. The way we build wealth is by making modest investments over a broad area over a long period of time. Let me show you how powerful this approach to building is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left, I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right, I've labeled shiny and new. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. They're in the same neighborhood, the same thoroughfare. Everything about them is the same except for the style of development. That old and blighted block looks like this. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks. What you are looking at here is the pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. This would have been the cheapest building you would have built on the far edge of town. And had things progressed as they had for thousands and thousands of years, what would have happened? We would have eventually gotten 2nd and 3rd stories. The buildings would become more intense, more ornate. Of course, that's not what happened. These were built, then we had the Depression, we had World War II, and then we had a completely new style of development that skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These buildings have stagnated for 90 years. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. We labeled it Blight, got it torn down, and now we have the new Taco John's drive-thru. You all don't have Taco John's here, do you? Anybody here experience the greatness that is Taco John's? Yes, in the back. Tell me what the key is. Thank you, potato olays. Exactly. So at Taco John's, if you ever get a chance, they're little tater tots cut in half, like half a tater tot, with spice on them, dipped in cheese, just like you get in Mexico. It's exactly like it, right? So I've been told. Taco John's. We got a brand new one. Everybody was thrilled about this, right? We got rid of blight. Now we have something new. It meets all the zoning codes. It meets the floor area ratio. It's got the right amount of parking. It meets the sign ordinance. We got rid of the on-street parking, so now the traffic flows more smoothly. The environmental people were happy because we got some native plants in the stormwater area. The bike walk people were happy because we got a sidewalk. The sidewalk ends right there, but we got that stretch. Everybody was thrilled about this transaction. Everybody. Here's what nobody bothered to stop and look at. That old and blighted block, that rundown junky block when this was built, had a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, it's only worth $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development. The way we built cities for thousands and thousands of years around the world. You're looking at it in its infant state after 90 years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. And we all understand what's going to happen to that taco place, right? We've all been around long enough to experience this. 20 years from now, that will be a used car lot. There'll be a new taco place a couple miles up the road. A decade later, it will be boarded up. We'll be trying to get some type of grant or tax subsidy to get it torn down and rebuilt, right? We've all seen this happen. We all understand how this works. In fact, in the few years since this transaction happened, here's what's actually happened to the property values. That old and blighted block is now worth 78% more than that shiny and new one. This is what we do systematically in our neighborhoods to devalue them. Here's what we do out on the edge of our cities. This is our biggest big box store. This is our Mills Fleet Farm. Double-sized big box, auto dealership, gas station. This is a 20-acre piece of property, the biggest piece of property, most valuable piece of property in the entire area. You've been to Mills Fleet Farm?
Yeah, I'm from South Dakota.
You're from where?
South Dakota.
You have Mills Fleet Farm in South Dakota? Please. No? All right. Mills Fleet Farm. When you walk into Mills Fleet Farm, here's what you get. This is why this is an amazing store. Auto parts, animal feed, lumber, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's the product mix. It is wildly successful. We have a double-size one. We have the biggest one in the world because we're the home of Mills Fleet Farm in Brainerd, Minnesota. This is it right here. When these people show up at a council meeting, we just stop the meeting and ask them, what do you need, right? Here's our core downtown. Same size area, just a different layout. If you have seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering but not so inaccurate portrayal of the quality of my hometown. In my lifetime, there's been nothing new built in any of these buildings. A lot of buildings that have been torn down to big parking lots. Some of them that have burned down that are now parking lots. There's been nothing new built in the downtown in my 44 years of life. Most of the second and third stories are vacant. The first stories struggle to keep tenants. We've made some investments. We're starting to see some changes. Things are starting to get better, but it still is a place that has struggled for decades. When we look at that 20 acres out on the edge, what we see is a huge sum of money in one spot, $600,000 an acre. There's a reason we stop the meetings when they show up. It's a big bunch of money in one spot. When we go to that core downtown, the same size area, just a different approach to building, what we see is a value that's 79% greater. How much money did we spend to get that stuff out on the edge? Well, we spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent tens of millions running sewer and water out to this spot here. We spent millions on frontage roads, backage roads. When I was an engineer, I actually designed this one. That was $2.6 million. How much did my generation spend to get this wealth here? Well, we didn't spend anything. That was wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time, and then bequeathed to us as an endowment of sorts, one that would continue to pay back in good times and bad times, one we could ride out, during times of struggle till we got back to times of plenty again, right? This was a development pattern that they gave us as this repository of wealth. We've slowly milked it down. What happens when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business? Someday it will happen. whether it's 5 months from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, at some point that will no longer be the highest and best use of that property. At some point they will move on. What happens then? What comes next? I don't know. But we can look around at other parts of the country and even other parts of the city where this transition has happened. And the one thing that we know for certain is that this is the peak. Whatever comes next will be lower on the economic food chain than this is here. This is the peak. There are 134 different properties in this downtown. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? Someone goes out of business. Someone outgrows their store. What happens? What happens when we figure out that, you know what, we've got too much retail and not enough office space? Or too much office space and not enough residential? What happens then? Well, it's okay. These buildings are flexible, they're adaptable. They can become many things. They can shrink, they can expand. We can cut up the space, we can divide it, we can open it up, we can do all kinds of things. There's a reason why our ancestors, and I say that in the broadest possible sense of the word, there's a reason why our ancestors around the world for thousands of years built in this style. It is flexible, it is adaptable, it is resilient. You don't have to know the future to make it work. It is financially productive. In a word, it is a strong way to build. I've shown you some sites. I'm going to show you some cities now, just to show you that this is a part of a larger trend that we see in city after city after city. We've modeled hundreds of cities around the country along with a group called Urban 3 out of Asheville. What I'm going to show you right now is financial productivity for different cities. If you think of a farmer going out and spreading seed across a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. That's where you get the most bushels per acre or whatever your measurement is. That's productivity. So what I'm going to show you right now is financial productivity. Where do you get the most value per acre? And I start with Buffalo, New York, because Buffalo, New York is a city that has lost population every single year since the end of World War II. It's been a continuous downward cycle. They've lost population every year. Buffalo, New York is very poor. If you would move there today, you can buy a home for $1 if you agree to stay there for 5 years and fix it up. This is a place that is desperately poor in many ways. Yet, when we step back and say, where is the wealth in this community? Can you point to where the traditional downtown is? And not only is it a repository of wealth, despite the decline, despite the neglect, but it absolutely dwarfs everything else around it. We see this in cities of all sizes. Here's a moderate-sized city in upstate New York, same kind of thing. Here's a small little town by where I live, about 1,200 people. When I first went here, they said, Chuck, we've got some great stuff happening out here. We've got some great stuff happening out here. These neighborhoods here are terrible. We've got to figure out a way to get this stuff torn down and replaced with something decent. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. In all those poor neighborhoods. In the neighborhoods where all the poor people live. When we look at this development pattern, it shows us the things we can do right now today to start to build wealth in our communities, to start to make them more prosperous, more successful, more productive. Here are, these are from North Carolina, but they could be any city. We've looked at this in many, many places, and the numbers are always very similar. Here's a Kmart, $384,000 an acre. Here's a Walmart, $967,000 an acre. Here's an old warehouse turned into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all-time, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. When we step back and we look at our cities today, big cities, small cities, medium-sized cities, when we get out of our vehicles and we stop experiencing the city at 30 miles, 45 miles, 60 miles an hour, but instead experience it at 2 miles an hour. What we are overwhelmed with is the realization that our cities are nothing but gaps. Nothing but massive, massive gaps. It is oppressively overwhelming. When you get out of your vehicle and start walking around the landscape that we have built, you start to grasp the fact that America is nothing but huge gaps. And understand that each of those gaps, look at it as an engineer for a minute. Look at it as an engineer from the early 1900s, a poor, miserly, prudent, engineer. Each of those gaps is feet of public investment. $1,000 a foot, $2,000 a foot, $4,000 a foot. You're walking along it. Where's the wealth in these gaps? Our country is nothing but gaps. When you start to grasp this, the question that needs to come next is, do we have the sophistication, the wherewithal, the competency to build something as complex and refined as Jimmy's Pizza? Because if we do, if that's all we can do, look at the wealth we can start to create. And not just the wealth, but the opportunity. We all understand the dynamics of this kind of business, right? I come from a small town. I built and designed parking lots and site designs for big box stores. And when I did it, I felt like I was making my community richer and better off and more prosperous. I really did. It took me a long time to grasp the business model here. What's the business model here? It's an extractive business model. This is actually the business model that this country went and had a revolutionary war to stop, right? We called it mercantilism back then. The idea that the colonies would provide raw materials, it would be refined and finished and the value added somewhere else, and then we would ship it back and charge higher prices. No, you can't make that there. No, you can't produce that there. No, you're not allowed to do that. We do that. You just pay and produce and create the commodities. This is what we called mercantilism. As small towns, these are just systems set up to mine us of our wealth. We understand the difference between that and this, right? Who's Jimmy? Who's Jimmy? Jimmy is your neighbor. Jimmy volunteers on the PTA. Jimmy sponsors a softball team. He banks at the local bank. His savings is actually paying, for your car, right? That was a loan for you so you could get a car or a boat or whatever it is you bought. Jimmy has kids that go to school with yours. He goes to church with you. He advertises in the local paper. He uses a local accountant. He uses a local ad agency. Do you see? Building wealth in our communities is actually really, really simple from a design engineering standpoint. What's complicated about it? Our cultural standpoint. We have to actually humble ourselves to see that as success. And here's the crazy thing. It is success, right? That's the most successful thing on this board. Look at how little resources it requires of you. Look at how little it asks of you. Yet look at what it produces. If we can humble ourselves to see the value in a place like this, there's really no limit to what we can accomplish. I'm going to end with this right here, and this ties into the whole Jimmy's Pizza kind of thing. This is a story from Memphis, Tennessee. I've been fortunate to work with Memphis on a number of things. Memphis is a desperately poor city. I mentioned Buffalo earlier. We could throw Detroit into this conversation. Memphis, they have very similar characteristics in that they've had massive population loss. Detroit and Memphis in particular show up on a lot of those lists you don't want to be on, homicide rates, out-of-wedlock births, poverty rates. Memphis has struggled in many ways. This is a little 2-block area that used to be a streetcar stop. In the 50s, when they ripped out the streetcars, they ran a highway through the middle of this neighborhood. Without the streetcar stop, without the foot traffic from the neighborhood that now couldn't cross the highway, these blocks just died. Some people in the neighborhood, fed up with the decline and the neglect, decided to take matters into their own hands. They went out, they worked with the owners of these buildings to get them swept out. They swept up the sidewalks. They painted their own bike lanes. They painted their own crosswalks. They went out, and for one weekend, they invited businesses to come in and open up and just show the community what this neighborhood could be. They got a clothier, they got a bike shop, they got a couple food places to come in, they got some art museums. And they just invited the community to come in and say, like, this is what this little area could be if we wanted it to be this way. This isn't the most spectacular street in Memphis, but it's a heck of a lot better than what it was before they started. I wasn't here for this project, but they invited me out here to see it 6 months later. 6 months after this project, every single storefront was occupied. I talked to one of the landlords of the building. They said they were able to charge double the amount of rent for the last place to go than what they were asking before the project. The city has since gone out and documented 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation. Total public investment, 0. We have become so obsessed, and you can see how this happened. We've become so obsessed with the big project. What's the big new thing we can do? What's the huge dollar we can spend to attract something new and big that will be a catalyst? And we've become so obsessed with chasing this dollar that we've completely overlooked the pennies and the nickels and the dimes just laying there waiting to be picked up. If we can only humble ourselves to actually see them. In my hometown, I got a lot of pushback when I published that stuff about the Taco Johns. There were a lot of people deeply embarrassed by that. One of my cousins runs the EDA and was involved in that project. I have another cousin who's actually a manager at the Taco Johns. Yeah, family reunions are awkward. So people were really angry with me. They said, Chuck, you're so smart. You think you know everything. What would you have done differently? Would you have said no to Taco John's? Like, what would you have done differently? It took me a while to figure that one through, to think that one through. And I had to actually reject the premise. Because the premise was, this neighborhood is blighted, it's in decline. Would you just say no to Taco John's? And my answer was no. I would say no to blight and decline. I don't accept that as normal or as acceptable. And so, along with a group of friends and volunteers, I spent a year out in this neighborhood, the neighborhood with the Taco John's and the old and blighted block, just observing life, trying to figure out what's going on. What are the people here doing? Where do they struggle? We saw the mom with the stroller walking through the ditch, weeds up to her waist. What are you doing? I have to get to the grocery store today. I don't have a car. It doesn't feel safe to walk on the street, so I'm walking here. We saw the elderly woman walking in the middle of the street with a walker, climbing over mounds of snow. What are you doing? I have to get to the pharmacy today. I can't drive. The sidewalk's not shoveled. There's no sidewalk even here, so I'm walking here. We saw the little kids walking through the alley, going around the mud puddles. What are you guys doing? Why don't you walk out on the street? Well, our mom told us that it's not safe out there. We're supposed to walk to school in the alley. We started to document these things. We started to look at them. We started to try little experiments. Could we change things? Could we make things better by spending a little bit of money? We put in a little temporary crosswalk here. We put in like a striped out bike lane over here. We tried to slow traffic down. Just little tiny interventions to see, could we make things better in this neighborhood? Could we signal to people that somebody cared? That actually this was not a neighborhood destined to constantly decline, but we could actually start to reverse that in a little way. We could actually take a neighborhood where the median house was $60,000 and make it a neighborhood where the median house was $63,000. And that would be a 5% increase in our tax base, which would be amazing, right? Could we do that? And at the end of a year, we came up with a little report we called Neighborhoods First. Here's 8 investments we can make in this neighborhood that would improve the quality of life of people there and unleash other opportunities, create this wave of like incremental investments and stop the decline. Now, my city just finished a $14 million project to run sewer and water 1.5 miles out of town to create a new business park out by the airport. We already have a business park we built in the 90s. It's only half full, but this one would be oriented towards the airport, all kinds of job creation opportunities and growth potential. The total cost of our 8 projects, $16,700. Put in a crosswalk here. Put in a bike lane here. Plant a row of trees over here. Yeah, I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. You know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? If we humble ourselves to not only experience our communities at 2 miles an hour instead of 30, 40, 50 plus, but to actually observe people who are using the city and ask, where do they struggle? Where do they struggle? What we find is that the investment opportunities are everywhere. They're everywhere. They're overwhelming. They beat you over the head. It's almost oppressive to walk through a community looking at it in this way. Because what we see is that there's an endless number of tiny little things that need to be done to make the place incrementally better. These are things that we can do on any budget. Any city can do this. Big city, small city, mid-sized city. And if we can humble ourselves to go out and say, where do people struggle? And what is the next smallest thing we can do to make this place better, to address that struggle right now? And we do that neighborhood after neighborhood, week after week, month after month, year after year. Not only will we be making the lowest risk, highest returning investments that we can possibly make, not only will we be building the financial productivity and the strength and the health of our communities, but we cannot help but improve people's lives in the process. That's what a Strong Towns approach is all about. Thanks for having me here tonight. I told you I would give you our address. If you would like, strongtowns.org is our website. I used to write 3 days a week. We now have multiple voices, multiple people from all over the country who are writing multiple times a day for us. There's a lot of content there. We do a podcast a couple days a week. If you're interested in getting on our email list, you can do that right there. I brought some business cards, also some books. The books are $10 a piece. They are like a best of from last year. This is our 3rd version. There's 2 other versions, but you got to go to the website and get those. I don't have any of I only have the newest one. So if you want one of those, just come up here and grab one and leave your money up here. We're just trying to break even on those and get the message out into more people. If you are inspired by this, the one thing that we do ask you is that you share it with somebody else. We're trying to grow a movement for cultural change across this country. We're trying to help people understand this, and the thing you can do to help us is to tell someone else about it. If you're really inspired by our message, become a member. It helps us in so many ways. And if you're incredibly inspired by us, our development director, Bo, is in the back there, and he will take large checks and bars of gold and whatever you have. I don't know how much time we have left.
You want to keep speaking?
I tell you what, I am a marathon speaker. I can go for hours and hours and hours. I can outlast all of you. I promise this. And I came all the way from Minnesota to do this, so I will stay as late as you want. Let me say this. If we have to go, tell me. if any of you have other things you have to go do, you won't offend me by getting up and leaving. Like, I won't take that as a sign of I was boring you. But if you have a question or something you want to talk about, raise your hand and I will call on you and we can do that. Please.
I want to thank you first of all, because what you spoke about tonight was really what S.A.V.E. was all about when it was born. And I would like to ask Brad,
Brian, yeah, sure.
So with this, Brian, one of the things I've been trying to get information on is the vacant areas in our towns, like Square, Avondale.
Right.
And those places are empty, which causes trouble tonight. And yet, I would also like to know the incentives that you're giving to developers to come out to this area, this route, Business 2025.
Right.
To take and develop that, because their bottom line will be greater because of your incentives, and it's easier to do going in and doing what policy says and making our cities and towns boroughs better.
Right. And we certainly want to make our boroughs and towns as strong as possible. The county's giving no incentives for developers to come out in the local corner. None at all. County doesn't control zoning, local towns do, but I'm not aware of big zoning changes.
Could you repeat what she said?
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry.
So the question is what the county's doing to bring. Let me put this on. Is that better? Yes. Sorry. So repeat the question. The question is kind of what is the county doing to help our towns, or also related to that, why is the county investing to bring kind of development, new development in the Route 1 corridor? I think, but yeah.
My first question was, how much area is undeveloped, that is developed, that is unoccupied, that is available?
Right.
And are there incentives for people to do that?
Right. So on the unoccupied side, I don't know the exact number offhand, but there's not a lot of room in our urban areas. I would say some have more room than others. Phoenixville would be the example of a town that's had a lot of room for redevelopment, because redevelopment, the old steel plants there. I believe that where our opportunity for investment of significant new development is actually our suburban centers. And how do they change over time? So how do our places like an Exton or a Great Valley change? And how do we encourage development in those places? Because there's a lot of room, a lot of parking lots, a lot of opportunity for development in those locations. On the issue of county investment, the county puts in, I believe it's $2.25 million a year into the urban centers for investment. They do not put any money into attracting developers into like Route 1 corridor or something like that. So right at the moment. I mean, perhaps in the past they did, but not right at the moment. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, please.
Don't you think that, I just want to comment, that the transition is already underway?
Yes.
Is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole millennial thing, I like to tell people that millennials don't want to live in a cul-de-sac or even a wildfire.
Right.
They want to live in a real community. And I also look at the development community. I represent some urban communities here in Chester County. And quite frankly, they're booming. And I'd just like to hear your comments in terms of that transition that you're advocating.
Yeah.
Is the extent to which you think it's taken hold.
Yeah. So the question is this transition already happening? And I would say yes. Although I think there's some nuance to it that is really important. There has certainly been, since post-2008, a shift that kind of started before 2008 but has accelerated afterwards of investment from, I think you could say, rural and exurban areas to urban areas. And with the suburbs being hit and miss kind of in between. And there's a narrative, and you brought it up about millennials Millennials like cities, they like experiences. There's a counter narrative that says, wait till they have kids and then they'll want suburbs and cul-de-sacs. I actually am more of a dollar and cents person, so I look at millennials as broke people. You know, people with more household debt than my first mortgage in some cases. Certainly more than, you know, I think the average millennial with a college degree has like $60,000 in debt. I bought a car when I graduated, like my graduation gift to myself was a brand new car. It's like $15,000, and I thought I was in huge debts back in 1995. This is like a different category of debt today. I don't see millennials being drivers of the suburban housing market. I also don't see baby boomers who are at that point in their lives where they're essentially not tied down with jobs, other commitments, and are free to move. They don't tend to be moving to those areas either. They tend to be moving to places that would be like a lower burn rate. And so I do agree that this transition is happening. I do think that there's a subtle nuance here, though, that I want to bring out. When we look at pre-Depression development and post-war development, I alluded to the automobile earlier, but there's actually, I think, a difference that is deeper than that. When we build post-World War II, we build everything all at once to a finished state. And when we built before the Depression, and really for thousands of years, everything was built incrementally on a continuum of improvement. What we see today, what I see today, is a shift from suburban and exurban to urban in our investment patterns, but I still see us building things in large blocks to a finished state. And here's the, I think, challenge with that. When we go in and we build a neighborhood all at once to a finished state, and by finished, I mean it's done. There's no anticipation of, this building becoming something more, something intense, adding more stories, becoming more ornate, going to a different, level of intensity. What happens then is that you essentially put a peak on it, a max on it. Think of a standard suburban subdivision. You go out and build it, single family homes. You build, 40 homes at one time. What happens is that 25 years later, everybody's roof fails at the same time. Like everybody's siding fails everybody's house needs to be repainted at the same time. Everybody's driveway goes bad at the same time. Everybody's appliances go bad at the same time. If we look at traditional neighborhoods where things were built incrementally, what you had was incremental building driving underlying land values up. And when underlying land values go up and the building value drops because of maintenance or whatever, it becomes an investment opportunity. We can now justify more investment because the land value is worth more. We'll buy it, we'll convert it to the next state of intensity. Maybe that's buying a single family home and making it a duplex. Maybe that's buying 2 or 3 and converting them into row houses, whatever it is. And you could go around to communities that developed in this way and you could see different life cycles driven by land values. What we have done is we've created a development pattern that essentially stagnates land values because it stagnates the development. We build, again, all at once to a finished state. I think that the trend is good. We're seeing the investments coming to urban areas. I think the next step we need to do is to change our approach to zoning and the way we code things to allow neighborhoods to incrementally grow and improve on this continuum. We need to get that investment paradigm back again. And that is a subtle difference that's not really reflected in the shift in just money that we see today. And in fact, let me just put an exclamation point on that. I think the way we're building today is creating another kind of boom-bust cycle in our cores, as opposed to creating an economic ecosystem that will evolve and change over time with us in the community. I think that's better than blowing the money out on the edge, where there's like very little reuse for it. So it's a step in the right direction. But I think if we really want to get serious, what we need to do is make sure that the investments we're making can adapt and change with us over time. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been asked the same question for other cities.
Okay.
But what can you say about the prospect of Amazon coming to Philadelphia?
Well, I don't know anything about the bid that Philadelphia's put together. The cities where I do know the bid, it's made me like retch inside a little bit. Now let me be clear. If I'm Philadelphia, I would love to have Amazon fall in love with me and want to be in my community. We have a word for paying someone to pretend they love you. Okay? We have a word for that. The more we act in that kind of frame, I think the more difficult things become for us. Let me give you an alternate model of economic development. There's a group out of Littleton, Colorado that experimented in the 80s when things fell apart in their community. They had a huge manufacturer leave town, took away over half the jobs in the community all at once. They developed an approach that is called today economic gardening. And they contrast that with economic hunting, the idea of hunting being we go out and capture our meal and bring it back, and we eat once, and then we go do it again tomorrow. And economic gardening being we grow and have a more bountiful harvest, and then can, hire police to protect it and armies to go fight other people and waste our money that way. But it's the theory is instead of hunting, we garden. What they do is they focus on stage 2 companies. So in economic development talk, there's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Stage 1 is like your coffee shops, your barber shops. You can think of them as like support places. The places that are never going to grow beyond their location or their small little niche that they're filling. Stage 2 companies import capital from outside the community. They have been around 3 to 5 years. They are the greatest growth in jobs you find in stage 2 companies. They tend to pay well. They tend to need competent people. They tend to be the driver of a local economy. And then stage 3 businesses are the Amazons, the well-established businesses. Amazon would be on the far end of that, but you can even think of like a business with $100 million a year of revenue. What we tend to do as economic development people is subsidize stage 1 and stage 3. We try to get the stage 3 to come here, and then we try to get like the Taco John's to open up. What the economic gardening people say is focus on stage 2. And if you focus on stage 2, what you find is that they do not need subsidies, period. They can get cash. They're entrepreneurs. They're real innovative people. What they need help with is things like, who are my competitors in the marketplace? Who else does a product like this? What are they selling it for? What other markets can I get into? How do I set up a healthcare plan? How do I grow a business from 10 people to 100 people in 3 years? I'm an entrepreneur. I know how to do this product. I don't know how to be a CEO of a growing company. So it's a lot of mentoring. It's a lot of connecting them with people. It's a lot of providing resources. What the economic gardening people has shown is that you can spend pennies on the dollar of what is spent in traditional subsidies and grow tons of jobs, good paying, stable jobs in many, many diverse companies in a region. And here's the amazing thing about that. When you can do that for a decade or two and create a real great workforce of people and a real great economic ecosystem, guess who wants to move to your community without any subsidies needed? The stage 3 companies. Then they want to be there. Then you don't have to pay them to pretend they like you. I think Amazon, if they're smart, will end up in New York City. That's where they should be. That's the place that is ready for them. That's the place that has the workforce for them. That's the place that has the infrastructure for them. That's the place, that's really the only place in this country set up at the scale that they want to walk in the door turnkey on. They're also not offering them any subsidies. So if you see Amazon end up in New York, to me, that's that's an indication that Amazon is making a smart business decision. If you see Amazon end up in Philadelphia or Newark or Indianapolis or wherever, to me, that says a lot about the business model of Amazon, and I think gives credence to the predatory narrative as opposed to the smart business narrative. So I don't say that as a bad statement about Philadelphia, just that Philadelphia does not have the breadth and depth of workforce that Amazon needs to come in and open up tomorrow. That's not a knock on Amazon. Minneapolis doesn't have that either. Amazon is a huge, huge company. Please.
What's your take on parking garages? I'm in town of 5,000 people with being to take out $3 million loan.
What's my take on parking garages? You're in a city that's going to take out a $3.5 million,
No, between
$2 and $3 million to build one.
Yeah, we got grant money for the remaining $7.5 million.
Oh, so you got grant money for the rest. Who would give you a $7 million grant for a parking garage?
Well, the only us $3.5 million.
Okay.
We're going to borrow it.
Well, let's do two takes on that. First of all, is it parking garage or parking ramp or parking? Isn't there like a geographic vernacular of what you call these things? What do you call them, Bo? Parking garage. Okay. In Minnesota, we call them parking ramps. I'm fine with parking garage. I know what you mean. Let's talk about three things with them. First, go back to the beginning of the presentation where I showed the new street that the city took over. It was cash flow positive, and then they got to the end and they couldn't fix it. Okay? You're getting more than half the money given to you. It may cash flow the first life cycle, but it's yours forever. What kind of wealth, what kind of usage do you need? Not just to pay your portion and between now and when it falls apart, but then actually go out and not have that be a dead site. That is a legitimate question that you have to answer now. The second thing, I think, there needs to be, I do think that there is a strategy whereby we eliminate off-street parking, surface parking, and essentially consolidate it into a ramp. So in other words, we're going to eliminate 400 parking stalls out here, and we're going to build 400 parking stalls in a ramp. Okay? And if that's part of the strategy, I think that there's some sensical, there's some things that make sense about that. If you can take care of that first question where you actually know where the money's going to come from. There's some things that make sense about that. But it's got to be part of that strategy. I see so many places where they're like, we want all these parking spots and we're going to build a ramp too. If you're building a ramp so you can develop all these other places, now you're making like a trade that, in my mind, makes some sense. The third thing is, at the end of the day, you have to look at a ramp the same way you look at a parking lot, which is a low-value transitionary use. The first story of your ramp, if it's on a streetscape, should be retail, or should at least have the potential to become retail at some point. The second, third story should have the potential to become something else as well. At the end of the day, the pinnacle of success is where most of the customers that you get would actually live within a short walking distance and not need a car to be part of your economic ecosystem. I realize that today, particularly in our small towns, that's not realistic. That's not going to happen. We're not going to get to that point. But I think as we look out into the future, that's like the thing we're moving towards, is a place where, in a sense, yes, people from outside the community would come in, but 95% of your day-to-day business would be on people who would not get there by driving. So to me, that's a transitionary use. Just maybe the fourth thing, and then we'll be done with this. I'm not like, I don't kneel at the altar of automated vehicles being like the saving technology for cities. I'm actually very skeptical of automated vehicles in many ways. I think a lot of the promises that are being made about them are going to turn into major disappointments. That being said, the one that I do think has the greatest upside potential is the idea that we won't need to store cars the way we do today. The cities that go out and spend a bunch of millions and millions of dollars building ramps will look awful silly if that comes to pass in the next decade, which I think is somewhat realistic. So, as a transitionary strategy, yes, but have that in your brain that it's a transitionary strategy. Please, back here and then back there. Go ahead.
A related question, might be redundant. What do you think of parking requirements?
Parking requirements?
Yeah, in the zoning.
I would just eliminate parking requirements. I don't think our zoning code should require any parking, period. And I do think that there's actually places where we should limit the amount of parking. Here's the really interesting thing about Pennsylvania. You have the capacity to do a land tax where other states do not. You're one of like 3 states in the country where at a municipal level you can opt for a land tax. You familiar with this? Henry George, yeah. And here's the thing about a land tax. If you go online, actually I just found this out yesterday. If you go online and type land tax, you actually get a video of me explaining the land tax. Yeah. Which is really absurd because I'm not like a huge land tax advocate. I think there's a lot of places where it makes sense. But there's some people for which it is a religion. Is that a fair statement, Bo? It's a religion for some people, the land tax? Yeah, exactly. Go on Google and type land tax, and you'll get a 5-minute video of me explaining it. And I guess it must be good because it's the highest rated video on there. But let me just give you like the 30-second version. If you have a parking lot and a building, in a property tax, the building pays way more the lot with the building pays way more taxes than the empty lot. Even though you plow the snow in front of them, you got the same road in front of them, you got the same sidewalk in front of them, they cost you the same. The one pays way more taxes than the other. There's an advantage to the person with the parking lot to just sit there and wait while everybody else develops and makes his land really wealthy, pay very little taxes in the interim, and then sell at that peak value at the end. That's bad for the community, great for the property owner. The land tax flips that around, and it says we're not going to tax the building and the improvements. What we're going to do is we're going to tax the land. So for your lot, we provided you both with sidewalk, road, pipe, infrastructure. We plow it, we do all this. The land is worth the same. They're going to pay the same. And so if the person goes out there and makes it more valuable, makes it wealthier by making an investment, their taxes don't go up. That is for urban areas, that's a much more productive way to tax. It actually creates the right incentives because what you want is you want people investing in your community to make it wealthier. Parking lots go the opposite direction. Holding land, just it's like sitting and waiting for everybody else to do the hard work so you can get the maximum value on your land, is going the wrong way for you. So get rid of your parking minimums, switch over to a land tax, and really create the right incentive environment for good investments to happen. And then back there, please.
Could you comment on the whole problem of gentrification and how the strategies that you're discussing play out as you enrich your strong towns? What happens to the people who had been living there previously?
I think it's a great question. So gentrification is the idea that we improve an area, and in doing so, we dislocate people. It's important to understand what the opposite of gentrification is. Gentrification is decline. So instead of investing and dislocating, we're disinvesting and basically having a cycle of decline. So is there an alternative to those two? Because really that's kind of what we're given today. And this gets back a little bit to my response to your question about building incrementally instead of all at once to a finished state. What we see right now a lot of times is that communities, when we start to see money shifting into urban areas and investments being made there, what happens is that a lot of this money follows the same, and for lack of a better word, I'll say Wall Street paradigm. I'm not trying to beat up on bankers so much as I am just acknowledging that the system we use to finance this stuff relies on a secondary market. A secondary market means you've got to have check boxes checked, and it's got to meet a standard pro forma and be able to be securitized and sold off like that. So it's got to meet a standard formula. And what happens is that we tend to build in large blocks to a finished state. So a neighborhood that is going to now get investment where it hasn't before, those investments will be big, they'll be disproportionate to the neighborhood, and what they do is they tend to very quickly drive up property values over a broad area and dislocate people. I made the comment, if you have a neighborhood of $60,000 homes, success next year looks like a neighborhood of $63,000 homes. That displaces nobody. But that's 5% increase in your portfolio. That's a tremendous increase. If you could do that every year for a decade, your property values would be 120, 125,000. Still not like astounding, all things being considered. Go from 60 to 120, 130,000. If you do it over a decade, that's a massive increase in your wealth, in your tax base, in your community. What we need to do so that we don't dislocate people is we need to discipline ourselves to work incrementally, to have as our measure of success not an overnight quadrupling of tax base, not an overnight transformation, but look at this as a long-term incremental process. And if we can do that, we can grow the wealth in our communities and not leave people behind. I'm not trying to be idealistic and think that nobody will, we're going to cure cancer and solve Mideast peace and all this, but we can do this in a way that doesn't automatically dislocate people and brings the most people we can with us if we discipline ourselves to do it incrementally. Please.
Thanks for a lot of enlightening ideas. Important topic. As a town planner, I wonder, are there case studies of a village hamlet, a block, a borough, a commercial district where you can share and say, hey, this kind of street infrastructure and this kind of zoning is economically positive, that municipalities can take home and say, hey, here's some examples that are fiscally positive?
I think that's a good, let me, we chatted beforehand, so I have a little bit of background. Let me say this in a very kind way. That's a question I often get from planners. And let me explain why. And I think that you are obviously a very intelligent person who has seen a lot of different development styles and a lot of different patterns and grasps local nuance. Let me give you the inner skeptic answer to that question, and then maybe we can discuss it a little more. I get one of the most frequently asked questions I get when I speak to groups of technical professionals, so engineers, planners, particularly planners, is what is the correct density to build a strong town? What is the correct street section to build a strong town? What is the model that I can put into my code that will then spit out a strong town? And I'm like, no, you have to actually think. I can't replace you having to think about it. I asked you earlier about your kind of architectural business and kind of alluded to a town architect role. And I think if we go back to the early 1900s, 1800s, we look at the planning profession as it was kind of evolving. what we see, like in the early 1900s, cities did not have a city planner. What they had was like a town architect. And what was the town architect? What was Olmsted? He was a planner, and we revere him in the planning profession as a planner, but he was really what? Like an architect. He went out and he designed places. And you can go to Olmsted Park in New York or Olmsted Park in Washington, D.C., and you see like inspiration from each other, but they're fundamentally different. And they're fundamentally different because the landscape is different, the community is different, the time is different, the maturity of the place was different when they were built. I think that this is not what you were asking, but I think this is a very important point. We take inspiration from Henry Ford and the assembly line. And there was some deep breakthroughs and knowledge that came from that. And I remember being in middle school and learning about like the genius of Henry Ford and the assembly line. But understand what we did. We, in order to not slide back into depression after World War II, in order to create growth and prosperity and opportunity, we took the lessons of Henry Ford and we applied them to how we build cities. We came up with model zoning codes, model street standards, model insurance standards, model financing standards. We standardized all of it. And so what we did is we created a model where, as a city planner, and we kind of derogatorily call planners zoners sometimes, because the idea is that give me something that I can like replicate over and over and over in a Henry Ford kind of assembly line way. And at the end of the day, we have to think, right? Like that's what we're being asked to do. So do we have case studies of like places that have been successful? Absolutely. If you go to our website, strongtowns.org, do a /success, you will see a whole bunch of places that are trying different things. They're messy. They don't all work right. Sometimes they do one good thing and 20 dumb things. And we try to highlight the one smart thing and like, let's build on this and copy this. We're all kind of trying to figure this out. I think at the end of the day, though, what we need is more town architect kind of people who understand the holistic part of it and maybe can't work off a case study, but can work off a set of principles and knowledge and work incrementally and figure that out. And I think as a general population, what we need is a tolerance for low-level experimentation and failure. The idea that we'll try little things and maybe it won't work and we're not going to fret over that because it was a very small lesson, but we'll move on from that. We expect government to deliver perfect finished products on demand, and that's not how any enterprise works. So I think there's a give and take. I think the professions need to actually embrace what being a profession is, which is not rote replication, and the public actually needs to embrace what a city is, which is a complex, adaptive place, and allow us to try little things and figure it out over time together. Is that a fair answer?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I have an announcement to make, and that is that if anyone would like to spend some more time with Chuck, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, S.A.V.E is having breakfast with Chuck at the Opera Hotel in Oxford, and anyone is welcome to attend. So I also want to thank you all for coming out this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I ask that you join me in thanking all of our speakers.